Hi, everyone. My name is James Lee, and I am a psychiatrist. And before you ask, no, I'm not psychoanalyzing you. You do have to pay for that. In medical school, I chose psychiatry as a specialty because I wanted to emotionally connect with my patients. I wanted to sit with people and listen to them and collaborate with them during the most emotionally challenging parts of their lives. And in spite of the pretty significant ups and downs, I really do love my job. Now, for me, one of the most challenging parts of my role is how closely psychiatry intersects with death. I recall working with a patient in the hospital who asked me every day to give him sedatives so that he could stop breathing. I told him I couldn't do that, and I offered him other ways that we could address his suicidal thoughts. And then he said something that made me pause. "You'd let me die if I had cancer. And I'm just as miserable as anyone with cancer. I should have the right to die." And I was struck by this because, in a way, he was right. The Death with Dignity Act in my home state of Washington allows patients with terminal illness to have access to medical aid in dying, or MAID for short. Now, MAID is defined as a practice where a physician can legally prescribe a lethal dose of a drug to a patient who intends to use it to end their own life. In the US, MAID is now legal in 10 states and Washington, D.C., with the greatest number of participants being diagnosed with terminal cancer. And though there is some variation from state to state, most require a life expectancy of 6 months or less due to a terminal illness and a physician's approval. But currently, people without terminal illness are not eligible to receive this medication. So it brings up this tough ethical question. Should people with mental illness, but no physical illness, have access to MAID? This article from the New York Times caught my eye a few months ago. Now, Canada has one of the most liberal MAID policies in the world. It's accessible not only to those with terminal illness, but also to those with chronic pain or disability. And in March of this year, the government was going to expand MAID to include mental illness. This meant that Canadians who were otherwise physically well, but struggling from a mental illness like depression or anxiety, would now have access to a physician's aid in dying. Now, when I read this article, my heart snagged. I have seen how devastating mental illness can be, how it can destroy careers and strain even the most sturdy of relationships. And I've also seen those same people get better in spite of the most challenging circumstances. Today, I want to give you all 4 basic principles that will hopefully guide your thinking as we ponder this question. Should MAID be expanded to those who suffer solely from mental illness? The first principle, mental health is health. Now, who here knows someone who struggles with mental illness, like depression, anxiety, PTSD, bipolar disorder, eating disorder, addiction, psychosis? Yeah, if you took a look around, there were quite a few of us, right? A recent survey predicted that nearly 1/5 of Americans are diagnosable with a mental illness, and around 5% of Americans have serious thoughts of suicide. And that number is actually closer to 6% here in the state of Alaska. In this discussion, we have to bring up this concept of mental health discrimination. Now, the stigma against mental illness is well documented, negatively impacting people's access to housing, employment, disability, and close interpersonal relationships. Mental health concerns can be just as dysregulating and debilitating as physical concerns. And one of my goals as a psychiatrist is to argue for the validity of mental health in order to reduce the stigma against it. Mental health is just as important as physical health. Right? Yeah. And I'm going to say it again because it is important. Mental health is just as important as physical health. Not including mental illness as part of MAID invalidates this principle that mental and physical health are of equal value. We also have to acknowledge that mental health is different from physical health. Mental illness looks different from physical illness. It impacts our emotions, perceptions, thoughts, actions, our very sense of self. Now, physical illness can impact these too, but not to the same extent. One of my personal pet peeves is when people reduce the complexities of mental health to neurochemistry. They're like, oh, there's not enough serotonin in the brain, you know? What? It's like, no, our current knowledge of neurobiology doesn't support those kinds of oversimplifications. And even if they partially did, we know that there are so many more factors that determine the fabric of mental health. Incorporating mental illness into our current framework of MAID, which is designed for physical illness, does a disservice to the nuances of mental health. But does that mean that there shouldn't be an option for those who struggle with mental illness? After all, psychiatry has limits. Our healthcare system has a lot of limitations, and many people pursue MAID because of these limitations, including the burden on caregivers, unaffordability of procedures, and inadequate pain control. Before we go further, I want to present you all my philosophy on, should I do what my doctor says? Every medical treatment has to do two things. It has to work, and it cannot have unacceptable side effects. Wow, right? Many of our current psychiatric medications don't do well in either of these departments. For example, SSRI antidepressants are one of our go-to treatments for depression, anxiety, and PTSD. They can take up to 4, 6, maybe even 8 weeks to reach full efficacy, and only around 50 to 60% of people report improvement in their mood with a first medication. And even if an SSRI helps with mood, many people still report frustrating side effects like sexual dysfunction, weight gain, or cloudy thinking. Another one of our gold standard treatments is psychotherapy, but that has its downsides too. Therapy takes time, effort, and money. And our current healthcare system makes it difficult to find a therapist with good chemistry, affordability, and skill sets that match our needs. Mental health care in this country takes a frustrating amount of patience and at times an unreasonable amount of hope. If we continue to exclude mental illness from MAID, we run the risk of invalidating the real suffering of those with mental illness, asking them to be trapped in a life that is miserable, untreatable, and without reprieve. I ask you to put yourself in the shoes of someone with chronic mental illness. How long and how hard must you suffer in order to earn a right to die? 5 years of crying yourself to sleep every night? 10 years of not being able to leave your home? After struggling so hard and enduring for so long, what is your breaking point? And in this conversation, who is deciding what your breaking point is for you? All that said, many psychiatric treatments work. Now, I believe in the treatments I prescribe. I've worked with many people who say that nothing works even after trying multiple treatments, and the majority of these people still get better with different medications, diagnostic clarification, or connection with a therapist. Psychiatry sometimes has this connotation of futility, which is well-deserved. SSRIs are but one of many medications that break the two rules I mentioned earlier. But the field of psychiatry continues to grow, and every day, new research is dedicated to innovative drugs and therapies that work better. One argument against this expansion of MAID is that the quality of mental health care as a whole would diminish. Would insurance companies begin to advocate for MAID as opposed to paying for the newest treatments? Would psychiatrists reach for MAID as opposed to a new medication? Would funding for research in psychiatry get punted to other specialties? At what point does expanding one's right to die begin to infringe on other people's right to live? From a greater societal perspective, we don't like to see other people suffer. Nearly a third of Canadians believe that MAID should be offered to those whose sole issue is homelessness or poverty. More than 50% of Canadians believe that the inability to receive medical treatment is enough of a reason to prescribe MAID. When energy gets placed into making legislation for MAID, does similar energy get placed into other life-limiting issues in our society, like homelessness, accessibility, discrimination? Or does it simply allow us to avert our eyes from other people's suffering? Now, MAID is not even legal in Alaska yet, in spite of relatively widespread national approval. So this specific conversation does seem a little far away. That said, I predict that over the next few decades, more states are going to have conversations about MAID. And as mental health is discussed more and the stigma against it continues to decrease, I believe that these two topics are going to inevitably collide. Earlier, I mentioned that Canada was going to expand its MAID policy to include mental illness starting in March of this year. But the government has since shelved this expansion indefinitely due to a concern about a lack of providers. I had mixed emotions about this too. Relief, disappointment, confusion, there's just a lot to process. I encourage you to start thinking about this topic now. To those of you who raised your hands earlier, think about the people you know who struggle with mental illness. Have conversations with your loved ones, consider the communities around you. Even after thousands of hours of working in psychiatry, I still struggle with this same question. But I do believe that sitting with and listening to and collaborating with others is the only way we're going to find an answer. What is the right to die? And who should have that right? Thank you.